This is TWiT.
Let's take a few minutes and talk to you guys about the book that you wrote. Of course, it's obviously a big accomplishment. You guys wrote for O'Reilly the book Designing and Developing for Google Glass, and yeah, I have to imagine that was a big pat on the back, because that can't be easy to write a book of this breadth. I mean, there's just it's super dense, super thick, and it's really good for developers who are considering developing for some of Google's newest initiatives. In this case, of course, Glass. I suppose a good question to kind of start things off is just the challenge that it is for developers to develop for something that's so new. And I suppose Google Glass has been around for a couple of years now and in the public's hands for a little more than a year. So there's a little bit of a paradigm there that people can kind of grasp. But we'll start with you, Alan. Being the Google developer expert for Glass, what is the biggest challenge, or what are some of the challenges that developers have when developing for this platform, would you say?
Oddly enough, and this is something I think we really try to get across in the book a lot, the developing part of developing for Glass is pretty easy. We really try to say, look, you're already a developer. You already know how to program. You already know how to do this stuff either on the web or on Android. Play to your strengths, because Glass really caters to things that you're already used to doing, already used to certain ways that you're doing things. The big change with Glass and the big difficulty in developing for Glass is just kind of thinking about the form factor. And I don't just mean that it's sitting on your head, but it takes an entire different way of thinking about the design, about how to approach applications that changes. In fact, the subtitle on the book that you may have seen is thinking differently for a new platform. And we really do think that Glass requires a whole new way of thinking about your applications. And one of the other phrases we like using is that Glass is all about actions, not about apps. So if you're thinking of it in terms of, oh, hey, I've got this application, works fine on Android, I'll just port it over here to Glass, problem solved, you're thinking about it wrong. And you really need to start your thinking over again. And that's part of what we try to do in the book, is help you think about how to start over.
Do you think a lot of developers have kind of approached it in that way? Oh, look, it's another version of Android. And I have to imagine that's kind of an impulse, because you're so used to developing for Android with a certain kind of approach. And then along comes this completely new, smaller screen size, different use case. You're not going to put a launcher up there or anything like that. So you just have to think about it very differently.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of Android developers really start off with the attitude of, oh, it's just another Android platform. In fact, I've seen a lot of other non-Android developers telling me, oh, I need to learn Android to develop for Glass. And when I explain to them, no, you don't. If you're already a web developer, you can use tools that you're used to using, like Python and PHP and REST-based stuff and JSON and all of that stuff that you've hopefully been using for the past few years. Just use it on Glass. It works. And we're seeing the same problem coming up again with Wear, that all of these Android developers say, oh, hey, it's Android, it's on a watch, I can do everything I did for my phone for my watch now. Great.
Yeah.
And they don't see how it's different and why it should be different and how people are treating it differently. And I think until they do, they're not going to really get the most out of it. They think they are, but they end up not doing so. And they create very, very unpleasant applications in some cases.
And I think what we try and do in the book, and like Alan and I spent many long nights, like overseas again, because I'm on Guam, I'm on the other side of the world. So I come home from work and I give him a call on Hangouts or Skype, and I'm like, hey, okay, let's talk about some ideas, or he had an epiphany that he wants to share with me, and we would talk about the fact that when you build for Glass, there are development patterns that you want to adopt and everything, but there are design principles that are a lot more generic and a lot more not necessarily flexible, but they can let you do a lot of creative things, but you still have to kind of limit yourself to, again, like Alan said, the form factor and the limitations of, working within a Prism display that is incredibly private to the user, using the person's actual real world environment as the backdrop for your application, which is a completely different paradigm than what we've worked for in any development environment, where you're basically just saying, you're thinking about this in terms of UI widgets and how you lay this out, because the person is going to be sitting down at a computer terminal, essentially tethered to their machine. And now you say, what is the person looking at? Are they staring directly into the sun? Are they looking at a brick wall? Are they doing stuff like that? And you have to factor these into the user interface of your application. So a lot of these things aren't necessarily brain surgery, but people don't really take them into consideration when they first start laying out their app. An anecdote I'd like to share is something interesting, because Alan gave a really wonderful talk on developing for Glass when he was in New York City. And jump in any time, Alan, but he actually took a straw poll of the crowd to whom he was addressing, and he said, okay, well, how many people have built for Glass? 98% of the hands went up. Then he goes, okay, how many people have actually gone through Google's documentation as far as the design principles? And what was it, like less than 10%? And people concentrate. Yeah, people concentrated so much on function.
Wow.
So much on function and so much less on form. And I don't, maybe that's indicative of our community as Google developers, because we put so much emphasis on, what can it do and the wonderful technology we can bake into it, but not necessarily the presentation of data and the way you structure your app.
Well, and it's like, where did developers for Android learn this? They learned it from their parents. They learned it from Google, because for the longest time, that was kind of Google's approach with Android, right? It doesn't look that pretty, but it does all these crazy cool things. And, at least it can do those things. So I think Android kind of was born out of that approach. And now Google's going to lengths to kind of change that perception. But that's an interesting point. It's kind of almost too far on the other side, to where developers are like, well, I don't know that I need to pay attention to that kind of stuff, because I've never had to before. It was just, what cool things can it do? If you guys had to kind of look forward into the future, what do you see is kind of laying ahead for Google Glass? Is, competitors, or do we see the whole idea of a face computer evolving into something different? Is this a fad, or is it a revolutionary? What would you guys think?
Well, I'll admit I'm probably somewhat biased on this perspective.
Yes, understood.
But I don't see it as a fad.
Yeah,
I see this kind of as the first in a long line of technologies that say, hey, wearables are more than just things that sit on your wrist. It's really kind of opening people to saying, hey, where else can you put a wearable that makes sense? What else can you do with it? How can the form factor kind of dictate different things that you can do with it? How does wearing it on your head differ from wearing it on your wrist, differ from wearing it on your belt buckle, differ from wearing it in your shoes, differ from wearing it in a hat? What are the different things that each one of those can do? I think Glass is the first one to kind of question that. Because previously everyone was saying, look, if it's a wearable, it'll be on your wrist. Mm-hmm. If it's in front of your eyes, then it's going to be virtual reality. And Glass kind of stepped back and said, no, there are problems with virtual reality. And we're at least 20 years out from solving those problems. But there are some things we can learn from the VR and the AR communities now and make our computing experience now better. And let's take those and adapt them. I think someday we're going to see some Glass evolve into a better form of augmented reality. But I think it's going to be a long time, because the key problem of how do you do something that just isn't distracting, that's a really tough problem to solve. And Glass solved the problem by saying, we're going to make it so that you see the world around you most of the time and you're not distracted. That's kind of the cornerstone for Glass and the cornerstone for Wear.
A concerted effort that we also tried to do when we were putting the book material together was try and explain a concept that, Google mentioned very, very briefly in the early talks, like in last year's I/O. And they mentioned micro interactions, which was a term that got kind of thrown around a couple times, but it was kind of like one of those blink and you might miss it terms.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of self-explanatory, actually. I mean, that is the nature of a micro interaction, if you think about it.
Yeah, and so what we tried to do is actually really explain what that is and what that means within the context of these type of applications. And because the device obviously makes information very omnipresent, and hopefully low intrusion, and it can still be high impact. That's a really interesting trifecta to try and pull off. If you come from traditional app development environments, whether you're building something for the desktop or you're building a mobile native application or you're building for the web, to try and condense a bunch of user interactions down to something that would be like a sub 5 second session. For a lot of people, that's really, really challenging. And so like what known web brands are trying to do, like, we haven't seen glassware from that yet, but we mentioned that in the book. How are the Hulus and the Netflixes and the Pandoras and the companies of that ilk, how are they going to implement the micro interaction model and do something for them? Obviously, you don't want to use Glass as a Netflix viewing client because you'll probably get only 5 minutes of battery life. But maybe you can manage your queue. Maybe you can do something like that, just getting alerts as maybe you can integrate it with your DVR and say, hey, this program that you're digitally recording is starting now, and something like that. So it's a completely different mindset to have about how you can build brand new concepts for the wearable paradigm. And this of course includes or how you can take known web brands and extend them to yet another client and still be able to do business and satisfy your customers and everything, but without crudely porting over old code, which is going to be like an insane experience to try to run on these things.